Hello, and welcome to our weekly segment of Ask a Historian with Heritage Mississauga. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And each week we're asking you to send in your stories, your things you've been curious about, and we'll explore local history together, the fascinating place that is the city of Mississauga. So please send in your stories. Are there things that you're curious about? Are there things that you've long wondered about? Why something is named such as it is, a road, a park, a village, something like that, or a site that you already well know but are curious a little bit more about its history. And so send us your questions, and we can explore the history of the wonderful city of Mississauga together. Thank you. Our first question this week comes from Barbara, and Barbara's asking about things that you might invite someone to do should they come to Mississauga and seek a heritage-themed vacation, if you will, or a trip around the city, kind of points of interest around the city. What would I recommend as the historian to visit within the city? And Barbara, it's a little bit of a challenge, actually. It's kind of asking somebody about their favorite children. There is so many wonderful things to see and interact with and visit in the city of Mississauga, and I'm hard pressed to point out one, but because that was your question, I will do my very best, and perhaps a long route to get to your eventual answer. But there are numerous ways to engage with our city from a heritage perspective, and first off, I'd suggest anyone picking up a copy of the Heritage Guide produced by Heritage Mississauga as a good kind of introduction to the history and the different sites and opportunities to engage within the city itself. Also, self-guided walking tour brochures. Many of the historic cores that make up the city of Mississauga today, of course, Mississauga born through amalgamation, but yeah, Streetsville and Port Credit and Arundel and Cooksville and Malton and Meadowvale and so many to count on. All of them you can partake in the history of the community by yourself with a guided walking tour, with a self-guided walking tour brochure. So I would encourage that. And in these times of COVID-19 and the quarantines or the social distancing we have, and the challenges that have come up with, particularly in the economic end of things in our retail sector that are really struggling in these times, be hard pressed not to say, once things reopen again, enjoy the ambiance that places like Port Credit and Streetsville provide in their historic downtown cores, and partake in the shops therein. And you can't go wrong. And Clarkson the same, and any place within the city of Mississauga that have those historic cores that you're able to wander through and touch history, but at the same time, do a little bit of shopping, a little bit of tourism aspect of your travels within. But then can you go wrong with a lunch or a spa date if you're interested at the Glen Erin Inn, the historic Glen Erin Inn, a gem within our city today. The museums of Mississauga, and there are multiple locations in the city. There is no finer ambiance from a bygone era than at the Bradley Museum down in Clarkson. You can't go wrong with the Benares Historic House, really one of our true historic gems in the city, and the talented staff that run that with the museums of Mississauga will make any trip to those sites well worth the time and effort to do so. So really the gems within our city. And maybe the new and rising gem would be the Small Arms Inspection Building, if you want to kind of see history come to life, but with a different vision and a different perspective. Go check out the Second World War munitions factory that has become a true cultural hub within our city of Mississauga. And of course, visiting the Streetsville Historical Society at the Leslie Log House, ourselves, Heritage Mississauga, at the Grange in Arundel. There's so many ways to engage within our city, but truly, if I had to push, Barbara, from your question, two things come to mind. I apologize, it's not one, but it's two. A stroll through Old Meadowvale Village Heritage Conservation District. You will not be disappointed. Take the self-guided brochure, any of the events that happen throughout the city. Occasionally there's guided tours as well. And within that gem of historic Meadowvale Village Heritage Conservation Area, if you have an opportunity to visit a private backyard museum, for lack of a better word, but the Meadowvale Miniature Village, which is run by a resident in their own backyard, is second to none within our city in terms of an experience. And a couple of years ago was voted Ontario's favorite doors open location, and it had nothing to do with any municipal structure or any funding. It was somebody who did it in their own backyard and on their own gracious open it to the public from time to time. So well worth a visit, and check it out if you have a chance to do so and you're able to find it open. And then my second part of the must-sees within the city, and it's near and dear to my heart. If I ever look for a place to I don't know, maybe I'm struggling for the right terminology, but perhaps commune with history, to engage with history, is a stroll through a cemetery. And Dixie Union has a charm to itself as a historic cemetery, but the one that calls to me and the one that I find most pleasure and serenity at are the joined cemeteries of St. Peter's Anglican Cemetery and the Cosmopolitan Cemetery. A budding cemetery is joined together in a geographic space at Arundel, at the corner of Dundas and Mississauga Road. I highly recommend those. It's just an introspective space, a place to commune with history, to be surrounded by history and the names and dates that really find themselves all over our geographic landscape as people who once lived here and helped shape the community that would become Mississauga. Ways to touch history are just an amazing experience when you start to delve into the stories behind the names that are emblazoned on gravestones. It might sound a bit strange, but St. Peter's truly is walking in the footsteps of history. And if you have a chance to go, check out the museum within the church itself, known as the Thompson Adamson Bell Tower Museum, or simply the Bell Tower Museum, dedicated to the congregation of St. Peter's Anglican Church, one of our oldest church congregations in the city itself, dating back to 1826, and also touching on the surrounding community history of Arundel and the environs therein. And so, there are many ways to touch and interact with history, whether you look at the Adamson Estate or the Waterfront Trail or go down to the harbor at Port Credit. The river and the harbor have drawn people for generations upon generations. And so, you take a trip through the interpretive panels that are scattered throughout our city. Visit Credit View Wetlands. Sorry. There are so many ways to engage history, but I probably haven't done a great job of narrowing down a single answer for you. But hopefully, what comes across is our city has a rich and vibrant cultural history that is well worth exploring and well worth engaging with, and connecting to the passionate and talented people that are associated with bringing that story to life and making sure that it is preserved and recorded and shared. And really a gem within our city is that vibrant story of this place. So thank you for your question. Our next question on Ask a Historian this week is regarding the Adamson Pet Sematary, the Adamson Estate Pet Sematary down in Lakeview, at the foot of Enola Drive. If you haven't had a chance to stroll along the Waterfront Trail and around the grounds of the Adamson Estate, highly recommend it. Really, truly one of the treasured landmarks within our community, and the grounds themselves are just stunning to take part on, especially in the summer months when the flowers are out. And but just a gem within our city, the beautiful Adamson Estate, the beautiful and historic Adamson Estate. So before we get into the Pet Sematary itself, just a little bit of history on the property. It truly does have a great past to it, and I know your question was more about the cemetery itself, but the property itself was granted to the Cawthra family back in 1809, and is part of a connection through marriage between the Cawthra and Adamson family. The property is transferred into the Adamsons through the marriage of Mabel Cawthra into Agar Adamson. There was a cottage on the property immediately in front of the surviving mansion, or the surviving historic house itself, that was built about 1850. A building known as the Folly or Gatehouse, no longer in that function, but nonetheless it was built in 1910, and then the surviving main house, the large house on the property, was built in 1919 in a Flemish architectural style. Mabel and Agar both served during the First World War. Lieutenant Colonel Agar Adamson served with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry during the First World War and was stationed largely in Belgium. They found a love of Flemish architecture and brought that inspiration back home after the close of the First World War to establish their own estate property here in historic Mississauga, on property they'd already owned, again through marriage between Mabel and Agar. So the house that survives there is built in 1919, and the house opened to the family in 1920, and in 1929 they expanded the house slightly and created a sunken garden. At one point it had a fountain, a swimming pool, quite a luxurious estate, and they were known as animal lovers, both with horses and with chow dogs. One of the first Canadian breeders and importers of the chow dog were the Adamson family, and the property itself, we know it as the Adamson estate today, but to the family they simply refer to it as the Grove Farm, or the Grove was a name given to the property itself. A much larger property than it is today, but regardless we still have this gem that survives south of Lakeshore Road. And so the house itself, the grounds were eventually taken over by the city of Mississauga. Today they house a private school, but the grounds and the waterfront trail are still something you're able to traverse. But your question was around the Pet Sematary itself. In 1991, when the grounds were restored and an archaeological survey was done on the property itself, scattered throughout the larger property were found a number of headstones denoting animal burials. They included horses, they included dogs, and those headstones were gathered, and a monument to that past life of the property from a family perspective was created for in respect to this Pet Sematary you see today. So the Pet Sematary is actually a collection of the headstones that were found throughout the property, and so the family believed again in that tradition of caring for their animals as members of their family. The plaque that is in the cemetery itself has a great connection back to the story of the place itself, and it says, "The Adamson Pet Sematary is a reminder of the tradition and honor the family devoted to their pets, and is a memento of home life past." So just a wonderful kind of remembrance of the time when this was a family property before the city of Mississauga took it over, and connection therein. So those headstones were gathered from the surrounding property and brought to a singular location to kind of create that memento to the family life past. If you want to read more about the family itself and the story of the Grove Farm, there is a book called Wasps in the Attic by Anthony Adamson, the son of Agar and Mabel, and it chronicles the story of the Adamson family and their beloved home in Lakeview area of Mississauga. Again, the Grove Farm, we know it today as the Adamson Estate, and in there you'll find some stories about the pets that they had, including one by the name of Zephyr, and he is you'll find his name on one of the gravestones there, and it said that Zeph is a dog that has never truly been at peace and loves to roam the property quite playfully. So for those of you interested in that side of the story, there are some connections to an otherworld experience, but nonetheless the Pet Sematary is a strong reminder of the family history of the place. And again, check out Wasps in the Attic if you want to learn more. Well worth a read of a landed aristocratic family here in historic Mississauga that built one of the finest landmarks that is housed within our city today. So, thank you. Our next question on Ask a Historian has me saying, say cheese. For those of our cheese lovers out there, it came out of the Ask a Historian last week when I made reference to the McKay cheese factory, and somebody asked me, caught wind of that one, and asked a question about it. So we'll get into a cheesy bit of history in historic Mississauga. There was a time when we did a business survey some years ago, and we had very little reference to existence of any kind of cheesemakers, and that was something that was very underdocumented and arguably still is. But through some secret research and looking at census records and some property records and the like, a number of cheesemakers have come to light, and one cheese factory in particular. And so, but just to step back before we get to the specific question that I'd raised last week, or the specific history around the McKay cheese factory, we're going to look at some of the others that have come to light. Between 1894 and 1910, Jerry Stillman, a cheesemaker, is listed as being in Meadowville Village. In 1894, there's an article in the Brampton Conservator that sheds some light on the early formation of the cheese factory in Meadowville Village, and it simply states, a meeting of farmers and others interested in the establishment of a cheese factory are requested to attend a meeting at the schoolhouse on Tuesday, February 22nd, 1894 at 8 o'clock for the election of officers and other business. Mr. Stillman, cheesemaker, is now residing in Meadowvale. So there's a good example. 1894, we have a cheesemaker in Meadowvale. It looks like they're forming up a business venture here to produce cheese. It says that the new factory will begin in the middle of April, and the building will be 28 by 56 feet. Another article in 1895 lists the cheese factory having closed down for the season, likely because the water was freezing at that point in the river. But the cheese factory is closing down, and they had a profitable season. So obviously by that point the cheese factory is up and running and is doing well by 1895. Jerry Stillman, the cheesemaker, is listed on the 1901 census together with his wife Catherine and children Pearl and Ethel. By 1911, however, Catherine is listed as a widow, and presumably the cheese manufactory closed with Stillman's death because we can find no other reference to it. We also haven't been able to find Stillman himself, and so that's a little bit of vagueness of what happened at the end there with Jerry Stillman and the cheese manufactory in Meadowville Village. We also came across references to other cheesemakers in census records between 1881, 1891, and 1901. George Scott operated as a cheesemaker in Malton. We know nothing about the operation at this time, just that he's listed on the census. In an 1895 assessment roll in Streetsville, there lists James Sills as a baker and cheesemaker. Another mention in Streetsville is an advertisement that appeared in the Streetsville Review newspaper in 1891, listing an Edmund Beers as a maker and importer of the finest English cheeses. Sounds promising. And Cooksville was also home to a cheesemaker by the name of William Cox between 1868 and 1881. So it does appear that there were certainly those that were fromagiers, if you will, or cheesemakers in historic Mississauga. However, last week I made reference in association to the community of Elmbank with an individual by the name of William McKay, and that was the nature of the question that came in this week. The largest and arguably longest running and most profitable cheese manufactory belonged to the Elmbank Cheese Factory Cooperative. The Elmbank Cheese Factory Cooperative, which was operated by William McKay in partnership with Robert Craig. The factory is located along the Etobicoke Creek on the south side of Britannia Road, just east of Dixie Road. It's a park area today, but the building is no longer there. We do have a picture of the building itself, but the property had been granted to William's father, James McKay, in 1832. McKay had come from Scotland and was a farmer by trade. James passed away in 1865, and the property was inherited by his son William. William appears to have been both a farmer but also a cheesemaker, again establishing the Elmbank Cheese Factory Cooperative. Robert Craig didn't live in the area. He was a businessman from the Burnhamthorpe area, and probably was the business supporter, the business partner, offering capital assistance to establishing the cooperative. The venture proved very successful. Surrounding farmers bought into the cooperative and were supportive of the cheese manufacturing. McKay cheeses, as they came to be known, won numerous local awards at local and provincial affairs and exhibitions, and the cheese factory operated until about 1910. So from about 1865 till 1910 are the years of the cheese factory. Very recently, a few years ago, a member of the Garbett family, it was descended through marriage of William McKay, sent us a picture of the old cheese factory, and that's something we can share with you. Can't do it in this format, but it is something that I'd quite happily share with you. William McKay was buried in 1914. When he passed away, he was buried at the Bethany United Church Cemetery, and that cemetery was subsequently relocated into Riverside Cemetery in Etobicoke. The family in the cheese factory were connected to the community of Elmbank, the lost village of Elmbank, is where the mail would have been delivered. As their name association for the cooperative itself was in Elmbank, and that's I guess a cheesy bit of our local history in terms of cheese manufacturing. But one of the things I wanted to share with you, just kind of fun for those of our cheese lovers out there, and I don't know how you're going to get a hold of this. I managed to find this at a used book sale, but selections from James McIntyre, the cheese poet, and as the bio says inside, perhaps Canada's worst poet, but he wrote all his poetry about cheese in Canada, and it's called "Oh, Queen of Cheese." So if you want to have a little bit of a chuckle and a story of the oddities that are the cheese industry, take a gander at the poetry of James McIntyre, the cheese poet. And again, as it says inside, perhaps Canada's worst poet. Didn't stop him from being prolific, but all his poetry is about Canadian cheese, and it's called "Oh, Queen of Cheese." So hopefully that has whetted your appetite for a little bit of perhaps wine and cheese, and enjoy. So thank you so much for the question.
Well, this week on Ask a Historian with Heritage Mississauga, we've got a special treat from afar. Richard Collins, many of you may remember Richard from many years, his involvement in Mississauga, principally with the museums of Mississauga, but also as a multiple time, my condolences, past president of the Mississauga South Historical Society. But Richard has been a tremendous support and resource in the Mississauga community for many years. Someone who I've come to rely on a great deal for his knowledge and passion of local history. Unfortunately, although I guess Richard, you're having a grand time of it, Richard has relocated from Mississauga to Ottawa. So literally, this is from afar. And thank you for joining us, Richard. And I'm bringing Richard in. Well, from time to time.
I should say, please excuse my long hair, because with this COVID, I haven't had my hair cut in almost 2 months. It's driving me nuts. So
I was going to say that's an ongoing challenge, I think, is
driving me nuts. So everyone would say, "Geez, Richie, you look like a long-haired hippie freak." At the moment, I am.
So this week, the reason I've asked Richard on is this week we had a question relating to the connections between the Indigenous Mississauga's village near the Credit River and the golf club on Mississauga Road. And there's a particular chapter of the story of the connection between these two places that I felt Richard was the absolute best to speak on. And we'll get to that in a moment. But thank you for the question. And there is indeed a connection between the golf club and the Indigenous Mississauga's village that was once located in the close proximity to the golf club. And that connection really is geography. The Mississauga's village, known as the Credit Mission Village, was established in 1826 under the direction of Reverend Peter Jones, and it was located along what we now know as Mississauga Road in the proximity of the golf club. And if you're driving along Mississauga Road today near the golf club, you'll have a chance to see the Sacred Garden, which is a tribute to and a remembrance of the Credit Mission village that was on the site. A number of interpretive plaques talking about the lifetime and the story of the Credit Mission Village. And also, for those that are interested in learning more about that time period, I highly recommend Sacred Feathers by Donald Smith, the story of Reverend Peter Jones. So the Indigenous village, the Credit Mission Village, was established in 1826, and it existed on the site. Had a wonderfully recorded history of it. The village grew and prospered for a number of years until 1846 and 47. In 1846, a decision was made by the Mississaugas in partnership with the Crown to seek lands elsewhere, and for the principal reason for being able to grow the agricultural society that they had developed. And they're also suffering from encroachment of non-Indigenous settlers in their immediate area. In April of 1847, April 27th of 1847, the Crown put the Credit Indian Reserve lands up for public auction. And shortly thereafter, the Mississaugas relocated elsewhere, and they went to south of what is Brantford, Ontario, and established the new Credit Reserve, which is still with us today, and where the descendants of the Mississaugas from the Credit River made their way following in 1846, 1847, following Reverend Peter Jones. So at the public auction in April of 1847, an entity purchased a great deal of property from the Credit Indian Reserve, or within what was the Credit Indian Reserve, and that was the Peel General Manufacturing Company under the direction of Frederick Chase Caprio. And this is where I'm going to ask Richard to jump in. Richard, I don't know another person who is as familiar or as I don't know if enamored is the right word, but
I love this guy. I just think
Life and Times of Frederick Chase Caprio. He might even be an idol. I'm not entirely sure of that.
Yeah, well, he's kind of a lovable loser because he had so many grand visions, and they all completely failed. But there's just something charming about the guy, and he's got a great port credit connection to him.
He does. And so, Richard, the platform is yours. If you want to tell us about the Peel Manufacturing Company and the interesting story of Frederick Chase Caprio.
Yeah, well, taking off from where you left off, yeah, as the Mississauga's lands were being sold off, there weren't a lot of buyers at the time because the economy around Peel wasn't that good at the time. The population was actually dropping in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. The census actually got smaller for Peel County at the time, which is unusual. And so I think that's one reason why Cap, as I call him, Caprio, decided to buy all this land, because he could get it really cheap. The land agents that were there to sell the land couldn't find a buyer, and he wanted to buy as much land along the Credit River as possible. The idea being that by forming Peel General Manufacturing Company, he would set up a bunch of mills, import credit, and then use the water power from the Credit River to turn water wheels, because there would have been no hydroelectric power at this point. That was still in the future, although it would have been a great benefit later on. And yeah, so he bought all this land, but he didn't get a lot of investors because a lot of the investors knew that the Credit River isn't really a very powerful river. It's a very beautiful river, and it's the spine of Mississauga, and it's a real treasure for the city. So don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to diss the Credit River, but as a river, it's a very feeble river. There's not a lot of water power in it, and there's no way that the amount of water there would have ever kept up to Caprio's dreams to completely fill up Port Credit's shoreline with knitting mills and carding mills, things like that he had planned for the time. And so he just found no investors, and eventually by around, well, he died in the 1880s, so really it was his son, it was Alfred Reginald, who sold the land where the golf course is now to what was originally the Highland Park golf course in Toronto. Yeah. And then when they came out here, they were going to call themselves the Port Credit Golf Course, but eventually became the Mississauga Golfing, and then eventually Golfing Country Club. So that's really the connection between Cap and the golf course. He died long before the land was sold. It was his son that sold them. For an amount of money I don't know, but I do know that one of the conditions was that Alfred Reginald become one of the directors of the new golf course, and probably got good green fees at the same time. And that's pretty much the connection, other than just these grand visions that didn't pan out. I can tell you another story that isn't really Mississauga related, but you may know that north of Sudbury, there is a town called Caprio. And it's a major railway junction where the Canadian Northern Line, which now CN, from Toronto meets up with the line through Montreal and Ottawa, where they meet just north of Sudbury, then become a common line to Vancouver. And the Canadian Northern named the town after Caprio, even though he was long gone by then and had nothing to do with the Canadian Northern. but he had been a promoter earlier for the first railway line in Ontario, which went from Toronto to Georgian Bay at Collingwood. He was a great promoter, but unfortunately didn't have any money, so he couldn't invest in this company called the Northern Railway. But the investors were happy to let him do all the promotion that he wanted to do. Finally, enough money was raised to start building the railway. The board had their first meeting and realized that because Cap didn't actually have any money invested in the railway, they thanked him for his promotional services and kicked him off the board. And he was never part of the actual building of the railway itself, never got any remuneration from it, even though he was easily the company's biggest supporter at the time. Then he decided he wanted to build a competing canal using the Humber River and the Nottawasaga River, which was ridiculous because by this time canals weren't nearly as effective as railways in moving freight. So again, couldn't find the investors. Great ideas, but no one who wanted to back them. So that's why I like the guy so much.
Wasn't there, I was going to say, I remember an article written about him that called The Dreamer and the Schemer. And referred to him as Mad Cap.
Oh, well, yeah, he may have been called Mad Cap elsewhere, but I just thought the connection was just great. Because some of the schemes, they were mad. There was just no way they were going to pan out. There is another story that has been told a couple places, including a good biography on him, so I'll take it as true, that in desperation, he wanted to become knighted. And so he apparently sent Sir John A. Some forget-me-nots and kind of a reminder of, I could use a knight. And of course, he was never knighted, I don't think. Caprio, I don't think the Prime Minister even knew him or knew much about him. And so that was kind of the end of his story, kind of a sad ending.
Well, I remember talking to Professor Donald Smith about this several years ago, and trying to make Caprio sometimes in his connection to the geography that was the Credit Mission Village sometimes gets looped into the story of the Credit Mission Village, and really they're separate entities. But when the Port Credit Harbor Company was formed, Caprio was part of that. That was for the dredging of the harbor and the building of warehouses and the first lighthouse, 1863. But part of the story
was he certainly needed the harbor. The harbor, of course, if he was going to get all these woolen mills going, he would have needed a harbor to get all this stuff out. He was an investor in that. There is some source that said he built the first lighthouse, but I'm not even too sure there was a lighthouse there in the 1860s until the famous one that was built. In 1884.
Well, part of the story was that if he was the schemer, he would have been making money off the backs of others, and the true story was that he lost his money too. So it wasn't necessarily a great plan for him or for the people that invested in with him. So
he took a couple people down with him. There was one guy who eventually be Cameron. Was that his first name or last name? Why is his name not coming to me now? But he was the first member of Parliament in the 1867 election for Peel. And he lost all of his. He was a bad investor. He made other mistakes in the past, but making friends with Caprio wasn't one of his wiser moves. So I was down with him.
Just when you look at this picture of the history of the Credit River Valley, a lot of what we talk about is what might have been, and the Peel Genuine Manufacturing Company has a relatively obscure history in the sense that most of what they planned never happened. But what might have been if Caprio's visions had come to be. I mean, at one point they were talking about the Manchester of Canada from an industrial perspective. Of course, it never happened, but the story of our city could well be a different one.
That's one reason why I like him so much, because if he had just, or if say the invention of electricity had come a generation earlier, maybe some of these things could have panned out, and who knows, Port Credit might have been a real factory town. It kind of became one anyways when St. Lawrence Starch came in later. But how different could it have been if Cap had succeeded in what he wanted to do?
So just to wrap up the question that came in connecting to the golf club. So we have the story of the manufacturing company and Caprio. Of course, it's coming to an end with very little accomplished despite the planning therein. The story was the Highland Golf Club looking for a new home for themselves, driving along in an early automobile, driving along the picturesque banks of the Credit River Valley. and it said a couple of the members got out of the vehicle and drove a golf ball across the valley and said, "Here's our new golf club." Which they then proceeded to, whether that's a true story or not, but they then proceeded to acquire 208 acres from the Caprio estate after the closure of the Peel Manufacturing Company and Caprio's death, of course.
Yeah, that was Alfred Reginald. That was the
yes, yes. And like you said, he then becomes part of the board of directors for it. But the Mississauga Golf Club, Golf and Country Club, is born in 1906 and have been home on that property now for well over 100 years and have a wonderful history of their own. But other than a common land base, are really divorced from the story of the Credit Mission Village because there was an entity in between. But so that's the connection between the two. They share a geography. They share a knowledge of each other's existence and celebrate those connections within the name of the golf club itself. The Mississauga Golf Club, which is spelt different in the city of Mississauga. Next time you drive by and look at the sign, some people say, "Why is it spelled wrong?" It's not spelled wrong. There's multiple spellings of the word Mississauga, and they took their name first in 1906, and that's the spelling that was chosen and is connected to the golf club. The city took its name, of course, in 1967, 68, and chose a different path for the word itself. So, but again, the golf club and the Credit Mission Village share a geography, a layer in time, if you will, or layers over time, but connected to the Credit River and the Credit River Valley, and celebrating a story that has multiple chapters. So, Richard, thank you for joining us. And
the other connection might be the name itself, though, because we're not too obviously they took the name Mississauga not from the city, because the city wasn't that; it was still Toronto Township. So I'm not sure where it came from, but from the research I had done, the closest connection seemed to be another board of director and another railroad builder, a successful one in this case with the Canadian Pacific, Lachlan Alexander Hamilton, who had a farm in Lorne Park and was a member of the Mississauga Golf Club. I guess it was just called the Golf Club at the time. And he had dealt with the Aboriginal people out west when he was building. So I think he kind of had respect for the name. There's no proof of this, but somehow the name stuck, because for the obvious reason, the name of the golf course today is the Mississauga Golf and Country Club. So somehow it stuck. How we know is not certain, but I give it to Lachlan Alexander Hamilton as the one person that was a member of the board that would have known and had some respect for the Indigenous people.
Absolutely, and early president of the golf club as well, and really instrumental in the establishment of the golf club. And obviously it's still around today and well over 100 years old in their own right, celebrating their history, have a wonderful published history on the history of the golf club. So again, different ways to explore history, different layers in time, if you will. So Richard, thank you for joining us for Ask a Historian, and we'll have you back on down the road. So thank you.
Anytime. I still miss Mississauga. I love having a good time in Ottawa, but I miss Mississauga a lot. So I still keep in touch with what's going on. So thanks, Matthew.
And I keep pestering you with questions. So.
Oh yeah, anytime. I'm happy to do it. Now that I figured how Zoom works, I'm happy to help out.
So on Ask a Historian this week, I'm going to turn the tables a little bit. Normally I'm having people ask me, and I'm having some fun in engaging in exploring the answers. But this week I'm going to ask a question. And I've got my first guinea pig with me here, and it's Richard Collins from Ottawa. And Richard, one of the curiosities that I've had over time, and you've certainly delved into different aspects of local history, and a lot in Port Credit and Clarkson, of course. And so one of the questions I had revolved around the original lighthouse in Port Credit. I remember lots of stories being passed on by people over the years, particularly Lorne Joyce telling his stories of the fisheries and the stonehookers, and you know, we all miss Lorne and the storytelling that he would regale in, and others in the community like Charlie Hare and others that have shared their memories and stories, and of course pretty much anyone with the Mississauga South Historical Society over time. But a lot of people are familiar with the landmark that is the lighthouse in Port Credit, but when it comes up to me, I always tell them, well, it's not really the lighthouse. I mean, it is a lighthouse, but in the spirit of lighthouses, we lost the iconic one, and they've done a a wonderful job with the replication of a marine icon in a community or port community of building a lighthouse, but the story of the original lighthouse and principally the loss of that lighthouse. That's what I wanted to talk to you today about. So Port Credit lost its lighthouse, I believe it was in 1936.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the story of the lighthouse and its loss.
Well, there's a lot of people that know about the story, but one thing I was always curious about as to who set the fire. Because when a building goes down, that's the first thing you think of, who started the fire. And asking around Port Credit for the 17, 18 years I was there, I had 100 different people who burnt down the lighthouse. If you talk to 100 people, you get 100 different names. Everyone seems to want to be connected in some way with the destroying of the lighthouse. I don't know why that is. But one day I talked to a gentleman by the name of Todd Duke, who was a member of Mississauga South Historical Society for a long time. Really nice man. And his father, Harold Duke, was the principal of the Port Credit High School, not the secondary school where it is now on Mineola, but the old one where Mentor College is now on Forest Avenue. And so one day I asked him, says, do you know anything about who set the lighthouse on fire and why? I was kind of hoping Todd might say he did it, because usually everyone seems to say that. He says, no, but I do have 3 names that I recall that he was told him by his father. So I kind of took these as close as anything to being the real names, because it came from the principal of the high school, who in a small town like Port Credit would have known all the families and all the kids, which ones were the bad kids, which ones were smoking out back behind high school and all that. Harold probably knew that. And so I can give you the names if you want. I think the statute of limitations is long gone. Do you want to hear the names?
Well, we'll preface it with say that this is what has been told to us. We don't know firsthand, but
yeah, there's no way we're ever going to know. But 2 of the 3 names I don't recognize. There was an Alan Dudman. Maybe you can look around, see if people know Alan Dudman. Ernest Paston. Don't know that one. But the 3rd one I found interesting was Alex Thompson. Now, it wouldn't have been, I don't think it was Alex Thompson himself, the World War One, the gentleman for whom the local legion is named, but someone from the family of the lumber company. And I found that name interesting. So that, well, what would be gained by burning down the lighthouse, except maybe that there might be a contract to rebuild a new lighthouse after the old one burned, and who would win the contract? Maybe the local lumber company to supply the lumber. I don't know whether that was the story or not. The story that Todd had told me, and seems to be consistent with a lot of what other people say, is that the 3 kids were smoking, and there were the slats between the planks on the dock, which had pretty much rotted dry as tinder at the time, because the harbor hadn't been used much in the past 15, 20 years, and they were dropping the cigarette butts down through the cracks, and one of them caught fire. So it was an accident, as far as everyone seems to remember. But unfortunately for all those people that live in Port Credit that feel that they have a great uncle or a great aunt or something that set the lighthouse on fire, those are my 3 names, and I'm sticking with them.
One of the stories I heard, and it must have been sad for the community in a sense, that even though they weren't using the lighthouse, it's still a bit of a symbol of the harbor, and probably connected back to a lot of their own histories in the community. But was that the lighthouse burned for several days? It wasn't a quick fire; that it smoldered and smoked, and or whether it was several days or several, a long day or something like that. But there are a lot of pictures of it on fire I've seen. And then the burnt out shell afterwards. So they were reminded until either it was demolished or winds knocked it over or something, like whatever the actual end of the structure. For a while it stood there as a burnt out relic. So it must have been a sight to see in the community, jutting out into the harbor. If anyone's looking for the location of the original lighthouse, is actually towards the end of the pier, out into the lake. Like it's stuck.
It's on land. You can actually stand with dry boots where it used to be, because there's been so much lake fill, the land being built into the lake.
Yeah.
So the lighthouse, which stuck away at the end of a pier back in 1936 when it burned, that's now on solid ground. If you go along the
that's JJ Park, right?
And there's a nice sharp curve, and just kind of where the land ends and the stone rock begins, right at that kind of a curve there, and there's some nice blue city of Mississauga benches. Yeah, you can stand right there, and that's That's where the lighthouse used to be, on land. That's how much the shoreline of Port Credit has grown over the years.
We might have a few viewers this week from Port Credit, so they might respond next week with some rebuttals on the names. But
yeah, I'm looking forward to hear how many names people can
if,
come up with. That might be a because that game for a lot of people, it's a matter of family pride, and maybe, who knows, those might not be the three names. But I kind of stick with them just because the connection to Todd Duke, and as a result, the connection to his father, who probably was the authority on teen activities going on in Port Credit in the Depression. And the lighthouse sitting there all those years, or I don't know if it was years or not, but for some time, really a symbol of how far down Port Credit had hit during the Depression. Right. This is a tough time all over Canada, and pretty rough time for the village. Although got a couple nice landmarks out of it. The St. Lawrence Starch office building is still there, and it was built to keep St. Lawrence Starch staff working when a lot of them would have otherwise been laid off.
Well, and also the remembrance of the village. If we try to think back, I mean, the lighthouse, the lighthouse that is gone, found its way onto the Port Credit town crest, and subsequently through amalgamation found its way onto the city of Mississauga crest. And so a lighthouse that was lost in 1936 is emblazoned across the city. So you're talking about a landmark with a remembrance. We three boys who boys will be boys and doing what they shouldn't have done.
Although the new lighthouse is still a landmark. I remember Councillor Tovey recalling once when there was the city had a contest to take your favorite photograph of Mississauga, and the most photographed building in Mississauga was Port Credit's lighthouse, which makes sense. And it was built in 1991, I think. And it sticks fairly close to the original plans, which is impressive because a lot of replication, or when they rebuild new things, they just kind of go with stock plans. One problem I've had with the lighthouse is that what color is the lighthouse? Everyone will always tell you what color the lighthouse is. It's red. And lighthouses are oftentimes red, but half the time they're green. And that's because when you're coming into a harbor, you have red, which represents starboard, and green, which represents port.
Yeah.
And so if you have to come in on the port side of a lighthouse, the lighthouse will be the green port color. You have to stay on the port side. It'll be a red lighthouse if you have to come in from the starboard side. And if you are coming into harbor, that's always when you go into harbor, you have the lighthouse is to the west of you or to your left, which is port. So the lighthouse should be green if it is a navigation marker, but it's not. But of course, that's because nowadays everyone thinks of lighthouses being red, and that's because a lot of them are.
I'll leave you that. I'll leave you that to convince them to repaint.
Yeah. Whoever gets a chance to repaint it. I think there would be a huge protest if it was repainted green. It would be accurate, but we would miss our red lighthouse.
Well, it is one of those remembrances where we often forget, I think, that we live in a city that is a port city. We do have a port. We do have harbor lands. We do have yacht clubs. We do, we don't often think of Mississauga in those terms, but we have a long, long history of being a port city. And of course, Port Credit, its name will connect to that. But
and it was a busy port too, because at one point I got some numbers from Ministry of Transport. At one point, there was over 3 million tons of goods that had been taken off at Port Credit Harbor. But I began to realize what that really meant is that everything was registered through the Port Credit Harbor, which had their offices in the post office, which is still standing, but almost none of that actually went into Port Credit. Most of it either went to St. Lawrence Cement in Clarkson or to the Ontario Hydro plant at Lakeview.
Okay.
That's where they dumped up all the coal, or they dumped up all the limestone. But because everything was registered through the registry office, which was in Port Credit, that's all considered Port Credit tonnage. But almost all of Port Credit's tonnage at the time was either Clarkson or Lakeview.
Well, it's good. Well, I think we'll wrap up on that one, Richard, and thank you for joining me this week, and thank you for allowing me to turn the tables and ask a question. And
I have fun.
Maybe down the road we can revisit things like I don't know, rum running, or
I've got some stories that have been told. Well, yeah, again, Lauren Joyce was definitely the master on that one, but I remember a lot of the stories that he told. So
well,
I can relate.
maybe someone that'll be a challenge. Maybe someone will ask us a question and we can revisit that one down the road. But
Yeah.
thank you. Really appreciate it. Great to see you. I hope you're doing well in Ottawa, and we certainly miss you here in Mississauga. But thanks for joining us.
Well, hi to everyone in Mississauga. Hopefully I'll be by soon.